A very warm welcome to you all, and a very warm welcome, of course, to Michael Ignatieff on this afternoon of October the 7th, a ominous date, I have to say. We might come also to that. I don't think Michael Ignatieff needs much introduction, actually. I just realized that an earlier version of this so-called advertisement for the Balie, you were actually featuring in it. The place of Christo Gozov was your place in it. So I would say probably almost everybody knows about you and knows who you are, but just very, very briefly, Canadian intellectual, writer, politician, served as the rector of the Central European University, taught at Harvard. The biographer, I would say, of Isaiah Berlin, which is, in my mind, one of the foremost philosophers of the 20th century, and a writer himself, the 150 Psalms, a wonderful book you wrote on consolation. And now, but also a leader of the Liberal Party of Canada from 2008 to 2011. So I actually asked you whether you would be willing to talk about liberalism and illiberalism, quite a difficult word. And you said, oh, that might be a good idea. I'm willing. I sent you two pieces out in our conversation. One will come out next year in the Liberties Journal, early 2025, you said, which is called The Adults in the Room. Some adults hopefully still around on the political international stage. And the other you delivered in September 19, the Václav Havel Memorial Lecture, Liberalism from One Generation to the Next, the Politics of Hope in an Age of Fear. And if we might just plunge into it, I think what you're writing is, a lot of it is new, and it's also a thing also for the future, not only for the sort of successful past. But, and you write about the successes of liberalism. You write also about yourself. And you're saying, you write that liberals are actually against identity politics, or used to be against identity politics, but you take into account your own identity as a liberal, which is sort of indeed a sort of a new thing, because liberals tend to think that it's just the way the world is.
I'm on a ballot, so I feel I've earned the right to call myself a liberal politician. But as you reach a certain age, you start to ask yourself, what are the guiding assumptions of what you believed all your life? And one of them is the idea that liberalism is moderate, gradual, practical politics, and it's a rational politics. And in a world of extremes and polarization, we are the adults in the room. We are not listening to the rage and anger at the edges of the political argument, and we are condescending to people who have been hurt by 40, 50 years of capitalist progress that have left them behind. They are angry that liberals often have a post-secondary education. One of the revolutions of our time, I was looking these numbers up, in your country when I began going to higher education, and liberals have spoken emphatically to those with university educations and sometimes not listened to those without. And that's an example of the ways in which we're so vulnerable to the critique. We're an elite politics, a politics that lectures to people, that talks down to people, that doesn't hear. My own career was deeply affected by this. People took one look at me and thought, here's another of these guys trying to tell me how I should live, right? So that's the negative side. And I didn't come here to engage in tearing my shirt and confessing my sins. And even though this is a very Protestant country or religious country, I didn't want to do that. I want to also say, there's another side to liberalism, which I talked about in these pieces. I mean, there's an immense amount that we, I think, got right. The liberalization of immigration beginning in the 60s, created a multicultural society. The feminist revolution transformed the family. The gay revolution then transformed how we think about sexual identity and brought people who had to keep silent into our family as full and equal members of our community. Decolonization, which liberals supported, helped to get the empire out of our heads. And all of those changes together, we created a way of life, which is present in this room, I hope. Tolerant, undogmatic, decent, curious about other people, egalitarian in the right way. So there's a tremendous amount of the liberal achievement that made me who I am and maybe made some of you in the room who I am. But it has this other side, this condescending sense that we're the adults in the room and everybody else is slightly irrational. Mm-hmm. And if not irrational, racist or sexist or the language of condemnation comes very easily to us because liberalism is a very moralizing politics. And so I just think we need to, I'm trying to figure out how to put these two inheritances together. And so I haven't got a way to bring them together, except to say, just lest there be any confusion, I don't want us to walk away from this revolution of inclusion that makes Amsterdam the city it is, that makes the city I live in, Vienna, the city it is. But there's something about the politics in the center which has collapsed, and politics has fled to the extremes. And we often say the problem with our politics is polarization and the extremes. I'm trying to suggest the problem is in the center. And this insufferable sense we're the only adults in the room is, I think, at least one of the problems we've got.
Yeah, so you're trying to not point at the extremes because you're in the center and analyzing what's the problem with the people in the center and how they could do better. Mm-hmm. Because if I read through this, I thought, if you actually read about this liberalism, it's amazing. There's this from the 60s onward. You're saying had the liberal revolution of inclusion that began in the 60s, and it's fourfold, like you just said. It's manifold, but also it's older than that. It's the international rule-based world, which is came about in 1945 and a bit after that. The resistance against the Nazis and the dealing in the Cold War with the Soviet Empire are, for a large part, to the credit of the liberals around the world, and especially in Europe and America. So what's not to like about it? It's wonderful. I mean, you see those achievements.
Well, there's no question that a minute ago I was talking about liberalism as a way of politics in democratic societies, but liberalism also had this international dimension, and again, getting that right is complicated. It's important not to be falsely nostalgic, especially on October the 7th. We think with nostalgia about a vanished rules-based international order. Well, this is a day of sorrow and memory for the 42,000 Palestinians, the thousands of Israelis, the soldiers, civilians, the hostages still in infernal conditions, the people dying in Lebanon. And we forget that this is a conflict that goes back to the founding of the international order that we think used to be so stable. My father was a young Canadian diplomat sitting on the Palestine committee that tried and failed to solve the problem back in 1947. So we've lived with this for a very long time, and we shouldn't look back and think, we used to have an order that worked and now it doesn't. Well, what we had was an order of mutually assured destruction which kept us the right side of nuclear war. That we did have. And we also had an order that at least the liberal democracies, the NATO democracies, stood against authoritarian tyranny. But we learned something in that period that I hope we won't. Again, it's a question of what do we learn from the past and what do we take to the future? What worries me so much about the current unfolding of international disorder is an increasing sense that a conflict with China and Russia is a conflict with China and Russia against the liberal democracies is inevitable.
You call it the Tukidian trap in the lecture.
Yes, I taught at the Kennedy School for years with a wonderful guy called Graham Allison, who talks about the Themistocles trap, which says war between China, a rising power, and an established hegemon is inevitable, and we've got to avoid that by thinking the way we thought in the Cold War, frankly, which is, on the one hand, stand very firmly against tyranny, on the other hand, defend ourselves against tyranny, but on the other hand, engage constantly. We've forgotten the extent to which we all learned Russian in the 50s and 60s. We forget the extent to which we had student exchanges, the extent to which we were constantly trying to make contact, people to people, track to, all that kind of stuff, pugwash. It's crucial as we go into this future that we maintain contact with these regimes, even hateful regimes like Putin's, even hateful regimes like Xi Jinping. And it worries me that there's something like 400 American students in China at the moment. There should be 400,000 American students in China. This breakdown of contact between these peoples is part of a drift towards something that becomes inevitable. I don't think that the rules-based international order of 1945 can be rebuilt, frankly, because Russia is bent on smashing that order up, in my view, with the invasion of Ukraine. And I think China believes that with time it will supplant the United States and therefore has no interest in maintaining the international order. And so they depend on the Red Sea shipping, but are sitting there watching the Houthis making international commerce impossible because they don't like the idea of America providing the public good of free global navigation. So that's why the international order can't be rebuilt, because we don't have those with whom we could rebuild it. So that's an enormously serious problem. In other words, the liberal order that my parents, your parents, tried to build is possibly damaged beyond repair. And we're nakedly dependent on nuclear deterrence at a time when we've just shredded all the treaties that used to restrain the growth and expansion of nuclear weapons. So we need to know that we're, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be alarmist, because I'm actually I'm an incurable optimist, but you can't open your phones. I don't know whether any of you have noticed this, and notice the BBC sending you an image of a Russian plane passing within 10 feet of an American surveillance aircraft operating in international waters. You can flip your BBC thing and you see a Chinese warship spraying water at a Philippines Coast Guard vessel and trying to board it in international waters. I could keep repeating these stories. We are so close to an accident that spins out of control that we just need to be very aware of this. This is a very fragile world, and part of what makes the situation in the Middle East so frightening is this is where the spark gets lit that just unravels in a way that we suddenly end up with what no one wants. No Russian wants, no Chinese want, no Iranian wants, which is a nuclear exchange between major powers. And so we've got to live in this world and somehow remain the adults in the room. That is, calm, moderate, thoughtful, rational, clear-sighted, knowing where we are. And this is the challenge we all have living this moment.
Mm-hmm. Without becoming condescending and without becoming a pain in the ass of the non-university educated. And so let's look a little bit back from this rather daunting international situation and an unraveling international liberal system back into the center, which you just described, the liberal center of it, which should hold. It's a quote of William Butler Yeats says, and still the center cannot hold, from his poem "The Second Coming," which is actually rather topical for this, because the Second Coming is about sort of the Armageddon which would get there. So let's not get into those sort of nightmare scenarios, but have a look back into the center, because you're saying, and we will get to illiberalism maybe and to Orban, but and I quote maybe a little bit from the adults in the room. Because you said that you rightly describe how liberalism was at the root of inclusion, of a tolerance, of emancipation of many groups, of more than half of the population, of course, of rather the biggest part of the population emancipation. But then you're saying, for instance, and you're rather harsh about liberals in that respect, we are deeply naive about the nature of the problem, preferring to believe that all reasonable human beings would embrace a revolution of inclusion, when the reality was that our generational revolution upended the entire social order, and even our own place in it. Diversity of gender, sexual orientation, race, religion, and class was a virtue in comparison to the dire cantonment of peoples in silos of exclusion. But liberals turned diversity into ideology. And here it comes. Once in ideology, it quickly became a coercive program of invigilation of speech and behavior in the name of dignity and respect. We abandoned the core liberal idea that arguments are true or false, irrespective of the race or origins of the person who makes them. We began privileging arguments as true based on the gender, race, class, origins, or backstory, oppression, discrimination, history of family violence of the person uttering them. The value that we placed in diversity and inclusion led us, by stages, to jettison a care for the truth itself. And that's harsh. That's so.
Well, look. This is why we're having a problem. This is why politics is spread to the extremes. This is why, in some sense, the center doesn't hold. We authored, my generation of liberals, with the help of social democrats, socialists, and conservatives as well. Let's not overdo this. The revolution of inclusion was much bigger than simply a liberal project. It was a project that I think so many people bought into. But it's generated a tremendous backlash. It's a revolution I want to defend to the end of my days, and I want to make sure that any liberalism in the 21st century defends it too, because it gave voice, it gave equality, it gave dignity to so many people. But it frightened a lot of people. People became frightened about the nature. What kind of family order do you want? It upset our definition of a nation. So the immigration issue is not about the numbers. It's about who are we? What holds us together? who belongs and who doesn't, who earns the privilege to be a member of our society. These are fundamental questions. And often liberals thought, oh, come on, we didn't engage with those who had worries that are foundational about the identity of the Netherlands, the identity of Canada, the identity of our societies. And we let the discourse of the nation pass to the right. I mean, liberalism has a very strong discourse of the nation, which is, proud equality for all members of the civic body, based on individual rights, equality, intense pride in the liberal democratic experiment, and openness to a full, inclusive debate about the problems we have to solve as a society. That's a good story. But we've lost the initiative on what it is to be a nation to Viktor Orban, to you fill in the blanks in your society. I don't want to get weighed into the Dutch story. So that's one problem. On the family side, as women know very well, the feminist revolution was an unqualified good thing and also upset the apple cart for men, for other older generations, and all the pieces are still coming down. We have to stay the course of the inclusion revolution, but we need to engage with those who think it's gone too far, or it's gone too fast, or it's... And then there's another final issue, which I think in some ways is the most fundamental. I think the great weakness of my generation of liberals is we never really looked at the economic question. And the economic question is a question about the inequality that began to be generated in the 70s and 80s after the oil shock. And I remember it happening. Suddenly we had many more losers than we thought we'd have. In the 30 glorious years after 1945, everybody seemed to be gaining from 5% economic growth every year. Then the oil shock comes, and then we begin to have a much more threatening kind of economic change that leaves a lot of people in the dirt. This is where the higher education issue comes in. Those who were left in the dirt were those without college educations. The rest of us could scramble our way up into the middle class by virtue of education. Lots of people were left behind. Lots of white working class people were left behind, to get more specific. And liberalism let capitalism rip in the 90s. This is what people call neoliberalism. I was very slow to see that deregulation of the state would have negative consequences. But a liberal thinks you have to have a state to tame the market. We love capitalism. We like profit. We like the opportunities for innovation that capitalist markets provide. We like competition. We'd like to see a little occasionally. That's the other problem. Unless you have a state to guarantee competition, the tendency of capitalist systems is towards concentration. And the tendency of capitalism is towards the generation of inequalities that have to be counteracted. Somehow, the economic question dropped out of our liberal agenda in ways that mean we now can't speak to those who are saying, I'm 55, I worked for 30 years at this damn job, and I'm being fired on Monday. I've been there as a politician. It is the worst experience you can have, because a liberal thinks there must be a solution to every problem a politician is presented with. Here, there wasn't. A steel worker who's worked smelting steel for 30 years comes to you and said, I've just been fired. The company's been bought by an American firm. They've moved to Illinois. My job is gone. What do you got for me, brother? Not much. That was a searing experience when I was in political life. Sometimes, let's be honest, there isn't anything you can do. All you can do is retrain and offer re-education, whatever. But we didn't put the economic welfare of the majority of citizens who do not have college educations at the center of what this politics has to be about.
Because it's still 60, 70% of the population, and it's not only about the higher educated.
Yeah.
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 And you, so the whole, you're saying rightly, I would say, liberals let capitalism, rampant capitalism, rip through our societies instead of, and it sort of disregarded the economic inequality it brought.
Yes, and then in, I think, the linchpin moment here, and a lot of the radical populism of the right dates to this moment, is 2007, 2008. I was actually in politics at that time.
The economic crisis of...
And what was immediately apparent was that we had a casino capitalism that was the casino was entirely unregulated in ways that the regulators didn't understand. I mean,
the housing crisis, the
housing
real estate
crisis,
crisis,
but the accumulation inside the finance system of capitalism of financial instruments that regulators did not understand and that were lethally dangerous to the stability of your savings and my savings. Now, that's what you have a government for. You have a government that says, you're not going to create that instrument because it is an instrument of mass destruction, right? And the mass destruction was, we narrowly avoided a repeat of the 1930s simply because in the crisis in 2008, we had some very great regulators. You know, we had Ben Bernanke, and in my country we had good people, and they pulled us back from the brink. But we can't afford that a second time, and it should have taught us that regulation of markets is at the center of any liberal project to tame capitalism and make it fair. And you know, the liberal idea of a society is we put granite under everybody's feet. We assume risk so that nobody faces catastrophic risk alone. And we lost that instinct in 2008-9, and I think we haven't regained it. And so when we go out now facing right-wing populists, there's some sense in which we don't have anything to say. That's the thing that worries me, because I think that you know, facts are stubborn things, and people want actual solutions to actual problems. And we don't have enough actual solutions to actual problems. And the other thing that is also very disturbing about contemporary politics, and you may have seen it in this country, I don't know, because you're a pretty well-governed place. You may think you're terribly badly governed, but believe me, on an international comparison, the Netherlands is a well-governed country. But I look at my own country, Canada, and I think one of our problems is that the capacity of the state, the government, to do things and get things done is slipping away. This morning I pick up my Canadian newspaper and there's yet another diatribe against the slow collapse of our public health system. And we've got provincial governments, federal governments, we've got experts. We simply don't seem to be able to deliver what every Canadian wants, which is you have a family doctor, you don't have to wait 6 months for an operation. I mean, basic stuff we're not able to do anymore. The reason this matters is that it slowly crumbles the legitimacy of the state, but it slowly crumbles the legitimacy of the liberal project, which was to put granite under our feet. So all of this is coming together. I think all of it is fixable, but we need to diagnose it accurately. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do in these pieces.
But you're diagnosing it you're describing sort of the failure of the liberals to hold up against capitalism, rampant capitalism, against an extreme left, against a claim of against prohibiting free speech, sometimes even because of inclusion. And you're saying it needs to be defended against the right, where I think that's a wonderful quote. A politics that creates anger without proposing solutions is not politics. It's only manipulation. And we, the liberals, is the we in this sentence, like to think that we are in the solution business.
Well, that relates to my previous point. We like to say we're in the solution business, but what we're substituting for solutions is virtue signaling.
Virtue signaling?
The politics of constant announcements that proclaim our intentions to do something that we don't actually deliver.
All right.
And a virtue signaling which then condemns attitudes which we think are retrogressive instead of engaging with those who have those opinions. And then we get into, outright censorship. I teach in a university, and often we are in a business in which we've created a steadily narrowing range of acceptable opinions, because everything else is racist, sexist, whatever the term du jour is. But it's all a structure of denunciation, which is a surprise for a liberal, since we're the people who fought for and centuries ago died for free speech. And that's the way in which somehow liberalism is turned against itself, swallowing its own tail. And that's a worrying thing. There are certain times, when I'm in a class, I'm being very direct here, where, I love teaching. I've been a classroom teacher all my life, but I sit there with students and I get this disturbing feeling that if I don't say certain magic words.
Like what kind of word?
Well, if I don't immediately say that Israel is a settler colonial state, there's a kind of, I can't listen to you anymore because I'm not in the same universe of discourse as you. And you think, what the hell did you come to university for? To be heard, to be told what you already think you know? Etc. So normal service will be resumed shortly. I just get, it bothers
Agitate.
me.
Yeah, it bothers you, of course.
It bothers me as a teacher, because I feel I work at a liberal university, proud of its commitments, but I sometimes wonder that we're producing a kind of monster, someone who has a vocabulary and a discourse that simply shuts down their capacity to listen to anything that would disturb their narrative. And that just seems to me a disaster for free thought, for free speech, and for universities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is that because you've been leading the Central European University for quite a while, and been teaching at Harvard and many, many other places? That's new, that sort of attitude?
It feels new. It feels new. I've had a number of students recently who, if I don't say that what Israel is doing in Gaza is genocide, nothing else I say can be listened to. That seems new. Mm-hmm. It's a new phenomenon. And I understand some of it. That is, what is happening in the Middle East now is tragic and terrible, morally terrible in every way.
Very dangerous, like you just explained.
And dangerous in all the ways I've described. And so I understand the emotions here. And I demonstrated against the war in Vietnam for all the years of my time as an undergraduate at Toronto and then at Harvard. But there's some ideological grip on some of my students that I don't understand anymore, and I think is a little worrying. And it seems to me the right thing to do is to fire back, take it or leave it. But my job is not to stroke the fur of the cat in the direction of the fur. I mean, my job is to, do something else,
As a university teacher, or as a teacher in general. And there's many things which, from your answer now, we could go into, but you've been in every Dutch quality newspaper talking about university, Trouw, NRC Handelsblad, and Volkskrant recently. Probably many of you have seen it. But this opposition to liberalism and sort of free thought and free speech you just described, and which is rampant on universities, or some universities, or parts of university, that's even more interesting, because the universities were, of course, where the liberal success was the greatest. Emancipation of larger groups, inclusion into the middle class through higher education. It was a very liberal project, of course, for decades. So from the outside, like Orban does, just take Orban as a pars pro toto, but blaming the universities for all this, blaming the liberals for all this, is where it lies very close.
Absolutely, but I think it tells you that, as you say, the university was at the center of the revolution of inclusion. It was the institution that, I look at the graduation photograph of my university in 1969. It's white males. I look at the graduation photograph of my own university 2024, every color of the rainbow. Women in the majority. They were not. They were a minority in 60 now. And so the revolution of inclusion is played out in universities in a way that I think has been fantastic.
Yeah.
But the counter-revolution now makes the universities a major target of the anti-liberal counter-revolution, of which Viktor Orban is, the leading spokesman. And so what seems to me grotesque here is universities are being assailed from the outside, but they're also defeating themselves from the inside. We must maintain an atmosphere of uncompromising pluralism of opinion. We must, American conservatives do not feel welcome in American universities. That's ridiculous. Conservatives have opinions with whom we must be in discussion. Radicals should be present in university. Conservatives should be in university. We've lost a plural exchange, and that renders us incredibly vulnerable politically. It means we look like little liberal covens huddled in, steadily diminishing covens, chanting over and over our ritual incantations of what we believe, while the incoming fire basically destroys our positions. That's grotesque. And you can't be a person who loves universities and not watch 3 university presidents in the United States going down one after another, 3 qualified people, like 9 pins to a conservative attack, which is attacking us for not being what we claim to be, namely institutions of free thought. Now, much of that attack is mendacious, bad faith, and we need to push back hard on it. But to the degree that it's true, we need to set our house in order.
Because, indeed, if we move to illiberalism, there is a tremendous international movement which is appealing to a lot of voters, which indeed is often a politics that creates anger without proposing solutions. Have you personally met Viktor Orban? You've been leading the Central European University, which has been paid for by George Soros for a large extent, and I have
never had the pleasure of evening with Viktor Orban, and it kind of is a delirious prospect, you know, but I take him very seriously. He's the head of...
You take him seriously?
Oh, yes. This is not a clown. This is a serious strategic thinker who's taken leadership of a very small country. My wife, by the way, is Hungarian, so I've got to watch what I say about Hungary.
Okay,
because
she's on the first row here, so we will... Yeah.
She may walk out if I insult the native land, but it's a small country, she would admit, a great country. But he has taken a small country and leveraged it into leadership of the far-right International. Builders is also has, I think, a Hungarian wife, so he has
much in common. Yeah.
He spent. We have so much in common.
Yeah.
And Kickel in Austria recently doing very well in recent elections. And I think we need to be clear here. The problem with Orban, there are many problems, but the problem with Orban is, and the problem with the far right is not, in my view, this is a controversial statement, not the views which I object to. The problem is simple. Do they or do they not respect the constitutional order of their societies? You know, if Wilders plays within the constitutional order of this country, the only thing you can do is defeat the argument and defeat him in the ballot box. He only becomes a threat if he challenges the constitutional order of your country. The problem with Trump is not that he's a right-winger, not that he's a conservative, not that he talks rubbish. The problem is that he refused to accept the verdict of a democratic election, and that makes him a risk, a danger to the constitutional order of the oldest democracy in the world. Orban is a danger not because he has reprehensible views about migrants. Orban is a danger because he's dismantled the constitutional order of a country and turned it into an autocracy, corrupt, disgusting autocracy that is denying Hungarians the chance of a good life. But it's the constitutional reordering of that society that should concern everyone. He threw us out of Hungary because we could see what was going on. He threw us out because in the project of dismantling a constitutional order, one of the things you want to do is dismantle universities. And everybody needs to know that. There's a deep connection between democratic freedom and academic freedom. I've said this before, but the most moving moment of my adult life was as rector of the university, watching on a Sunday afternoon in 2017, 80,000 Hungarian citizens of Budapest walking past my university, chanting, "Free universities in a free society." They understood immediately what was at stake. That an attack on a free university is an attack on democracy. And they saw that together. So Orban's project is to eliminate every intermediate independent institution in the country. And the worry that anybody has about the far right is not their views in themselves, but the extent to which they would use power to dismantle the constitutional order. And that's when you have to go into the street. That's when the arguments are over. They cannot be allowed to change the rules of the democratic game. That's the core issue. And that's where liberals, as opposed to being what we usually are, accommodating, nice, friendly, let's make a compromise, that's where the compromises stop. That's when you fight. That's when you march. That's when you sit down and block the traffic if you have to. That's when you engage in civil disobedience. I hope we never get there. But we're a month away from an American election, and if we have a second denial of the legitimacy of a valid election, we're in absolutely uncharted waters. And then liberals will have to go into the streets. And I pray that we have a result that is fair and clear, and even if it's Mr. Trump, it's fair, he wins the election, fine. The other side concedes and we get through that. But the denial of a valid election result is a mortal threat to democratic freedom, and let's just pray it doesn't happen.
But also you're saying the challenge to the constitutional order is a mortal threat, like Viktor Orban did, like the Peace and Justice Party in Poland tried to do,
Yes.
and it's been reversed now partly
Yes.
by the incumbent government
Yes,
in
and
Poland.
that's good news. That's an example where an authoritarian turn was turned back by a democratic process.
But listening to you, if there is a clear and fair election and Mr. Trump wins, he might, in my opinion, change the constitutional order. He said so that he will. In general, listen to dictators and they will tell you what they will do, sort of clearly. What you would... So there's a threat to...
What I'm
so
saying...
every constitutional order in the world, once the oldest democracy in the world, turns to authoritarianism.
I'm saying if Trump wins free and fair, if the election is certified, it would be a catastrophic mistake for liberals to try and overturn that result with civil disobedience. I'm saying you accept that result, and then if he deploys, for example, the military,
For instance?
to dispel a peaceful demonstration, which is it's a principle of a free society that we don't talk about, which is the military do not go into the streets in the United States. This is a police matter. If he crosses that line, that's an example of a clear breaking of a line. Then you demonstrate. But if he's won the election free and fair, you swallow hard, you cry, you do whatever you do, and then you mount a peaceful, lawful opposition and seek to win the next election and ensure that there is an election. Were he to cancel the election again, then all bets are off and you have to write. But if he wins it free and fair, I'm afraid I would be against demonstrations, because it seems to me you can't have it both ways. If he wins, he wins. Mm-hmm. Unpleasant as that may be for all of us.
Mm-hmm. And but then you seem to point to the fact that because it's mind-boggling, isn't it? In many ways, a policy which creates anger, and a lot of politicians now do, doesn't come up with solutions for voters. Mm. And you seem to suggest, especially in your lecture about Václav Havel, that in the end there is the hope that the electorate will turn back to the facts, so that fueling anger will in the end not be enough, because it will not bring you enough housing, for instance, or a good education for your children, or your pensions, or that's a faint hope, isn't it?
It's only a hope that you and I and everybody in this room are partly, occasionally rational. I mean, God knows I'm not, as my wife would say, my rationality is borderline at times. But I do think I'm an incurable optimist for that reason, which is that I think we explore every kind of folly in our lives and make countless mistakes and crawl our way back to the right path after painful experience. And I think that's true in politics. I think that's true in life. People want actual solutions to problems. And they need to let for example, their actual experience of migrants and migration and people of other lands and cultures begin to permeate into their politics, so that they stop living in an ideological world divorced from their actual experience. Because I do think that the multicultural society that's been built here, that I see in the streets outside, that I see in this room, that I see in my own country, is one of the great human achievements. It's an experiment. It's new for all of us. It's a little threatening sometimes, actually, because difference these differences are difficult to understand. And there are people coming into our countries who don't understand the rules. And they need to understand the rules about women, about equality, about gender, about the rule of law, about all these things. And we need to be unapologetic about saying, here are the rules that we live by. But we're in the middle of an experiment. And I think it's important. This is where being ancient like me helps me to be hopeful. I grew up in a white city. In 2034, the city of my birth, I will be a minority in the city of my birth. And the city of my birth is infinitely richer, better, stronger, and more interesting place to live than the boring town I grew up in, and that I longed to escape and did escape. So we have to see that. We have to understand how much we've gone through, how much we've accomplished in this regard, and how much better life is thanks to feminism, for example, as a bloke. I mean, it's changed our lives for the better, all the way down. It's created a whole set of problems we're struggling with in our bedrooms and in our lives and in our childcare and in our marriages, but I'd rather have those problems than any of the problems we used to have. So we need to stay the course of this revolution, but understand it as a revolution. And if it's a revolution, it's upset everybody. It's upset everybody's apple cart. And we need to listen more carefully to those who are more frightened and more upset and more disturbed and more threatened by this, and engage and find some ways to pull us together in renewed faith in this experiment we're on. Maybe we should.
Yeah, we will go to the room shortly.
He's not done with me yet.
No, because this feminism, this emancipation, this world liberalism to a large extent broad, there would be another reason, of course, to sort of stay with liberalism in the real sense, or your sense of the word, or in the, and that's of course because we're facing a very illiberal coalition of Russians, Iranians, suppressing in Iran half their population, at least half, the female population, and probably North Korea and maybe China behind it. And as you mentioned also in your writings, Brazil, South Africa, and India sort of sitting on the fence for it. So we're facing a real old-fashioned, illiberal, my old teacher Andreas Bonnier would have said masculine coalition.
Yeah.
Anti-liberal, at least.
Yes. And we have to be, I'm worried in Europe that we don't understand that clearly enough. We think there's so much fighting and dying in the Ukraine, couldn't we just cut a deal here? We all want peace. We can all sense the Ukrainians are exhausted. We can all sense the battlefield is not going well.
Probably, yeah.
We all sense that our budgets are strapped, and so we're a little concerned of what it's going to cost us to keep sustaining this. But Putin is in this for the long haul. And Putin wants this, unfortunately, more than we do, and that's a huge problem. But if we give in...
He wants it more because his survival depends on it.
Yes,
also. Mm-hmm.
He wants it more, and there's a growing chorus of reasonable, adult, sensible opinion that is going to urge the Ukrainians to basically make a deal, a Carthaginian peace, a peace that allows, 25% of their territory to be ceded forever, that concedes that a neighboring state can pound your civil infrastructure for 3 years and get away with it. A peace that would insist that it doesn't join NATO, for example. All these reasonable, rational things when seen in the context that you're putting it in, which is this is not just about Russia, this is about China, Iran, and North Korea, a axis of resistance that is challenging every element of the international order, that if they win there, it's not good for Taiwan. It's not good for peace in East Asia. It's not good for South Korea, wonderful democratic country. If Iran comes out of it winning, it's not good for Israel, it's not good for the Middle East. In other words, Ukraine and its fate are yoked into consequences that ripple through the entire global order. And that's why we need to keep supporting the Ukrainians. We need to keep shipping them weapons. We need to allow them to fight hard. And we need all that. But we also need, what I said half an hour ago, is we need to engage constantly with the enemy. You know, I feel better every time I discover that, you know, Jake Sullivan has had a secret meeting with some Chinese guy at a Viennese hotel. You think we need a lot more of that. We need, in fact, European leaders going to see Putin all the time. We need a constant strategy of engagement, so we're at least speaking the same. We're speaking to each other, and we need people-to-people exchanges constantly, because I worry tremendously that what I want to avoid as a liberal is getting us into a Manichaean division of the world between the free democracies and the forces of darkness. We start creating an ideology about that, we get lost. We need to resist. We need to hold them back. We need to use military power and diplomatic power to hold them back. But we also must engage them, because otherwise, that was the lesson of the Cold War. We won the Cold War partly because we said no, and then we said, let's talk. And it's that combination that's crucial to our safety in the 21st century. This is a lesson from the Cold War that I think is deeply relevant now. Refuse, I mean, you know, in the United States, there's this kind of Manichaean view of China, which terrifies me. This is a great civilization, fantastic human achievements behind it. We need to be engaging with that and standing firm against the regime, if you see what I mean. And it's that complexity in our engagement with these countries that I think we need.
So
Sorry to go on and on.
So the Manichaean divide on universities, where they cannot listen to you unless you say some magical words, and the Manichaean divide in the international order.
We need to avoid it. The strength of a liberal position is we got to talk. We got to talk. Then there's a moment when we can't talk anymore, but until that moment, we got to talk.
Yeah. I'm going to quote one more time from your excellent, really excellent essay. It comes out early next year. I would recommend it to everybody. Liberalism today would do well to be less self-deceiving about its opponents. It likes to believe that it only faces adversaries who could be allies tomorrow. But there are some enemies in the house, dangerous to democracy, fatal to every liberal achievement, who simply have to be defeated over and over again. Sort of the old lesson of the generation before, the generation won the big war. But do talk. Yeah.
Yes, there you go.
Let's have a look at the adults in the room and see whether there's people who want to join in. I'd like to remind you that a question is a sentence which sort of slightly moves upwards in tone to the end of the sentence and has a question mark at the end.
Yeah, not a lot of people know that.
Yeah. And there might be people who, not everybody at once, but is there anybody? There's a gentleman over here. Yes, right. Our colleague will hold a microphone for you.
Paulstown, and two questions. One is, You talked about the 80.
Let's start with one and then see what.
You talked about the 80,000 students demonstrating in front of the Central European University in Budapest. It did not help and prevent the government to pull you out, or perhaps you left by yourself because it was impossible. Anyhow, but what happened to this resistance movement, clearly centered around your university? That is one point, and the other is of curiosity, how George Soros, also an Hungarian, has been declared enemy of the state, enemy number one of the state. Is he still involved in his project of open society and in your university?
Yeah. I'm glad you raised George Soros, because it allows me to raise a very difficult subject that we need to talk about, and that's anti-Semitism. When our university was attacked, it was part of an election campaign in which Viktor Orban made George Soros, the founder of our university, public enemy number one. And every billboard, every public space in Budapest and the rest of Hungary was covered with a poster you saw everywhere that said, "Don't let George Soros have the last laugh," and showed a picture of George Soros laughing. George Soros was blamed for the migrant crisis of 2015. It was alleged that George had offered, Afghans money to invade Hungary. Fantastic stuff. If a cloud gathered over Budapest and it threatened rain, he was blamed for the cloud. I mean, it was just, and for 18 months of that election campaign, my people, wonderful people at CU, had to go to work on trams where George Soros's face was on the floor of the tram. The posters were put on the floor of the tram so people could walk on his face. If you then said, "Do you notice something about this poster?" namely that it is a reproduction of the Völkische Beobachter of 1933, in which it's a standard Nazi trope. Why are the Jews laughing at us? We want to wipe the smile off the Jew's face, which is an absolutely standard trope of Nazi propaganda in the 1930s. And you said to people in the Hungarian government, "Don't you realize you're reusing Nazi tropes to win an election campaign?" They then say, "How dare you call me an anti-Semite? Some of my best friends are Jewish." So the reason I go on about this is that we need to understand that there's a 21st century anti-Semitism, which is quite different from the anti-Semitism of the 30s. Goebbels and Hitler rejoiced in being anti-Semites. You now have an anti-Semitism that uses the tropes of the 30s and then denies it's doing so. So it's an absolutely fascinating, deeply sinister development which Orban has perfected. And you should watch it coming to a neighborhood near you, is all I can say. That's one of the things I took away from my experience in Hungary. And George is still involved in the university and funded it. He set it up because he thought, not a bad idea, that a free society needs a free university. And as the society transitions from communism, you need parliamentary institutions and you need a free university. That's why he set us up, and we're still there. So thank you for your question.
There's a gentleman in the back in the blue pullover, I think.
Well, thank you very much. It was very interesting, and I learned a lot. But there's one point that I had a little bit of trouble understanding, and I think it was when you talked about Kickel and Wilders, and you said something like that it's not necessarily their views, but it was mostly their desire to break down the Constitution and the rules that, you have mostly trouble with that. But I find it's a little bit difficult to understand because, in my opinion, it's mostly their views being so ridiculous that leads them to break down the Constitution. So somebody like Kickel, for example, or Wilders, he wants to, I don't know, stop immigration, throw out all of the immigrants. And that, I mean, they can't do that because they have to abide by European policies. So they have to break down the rules. So it feels like me there's like real, like, how do you say that, interplay between their views and their desire to break down the Constitution. Could you talk a little bit more about this?
I'm glad you've asked the question because I think it gives me an opportunity to be a little clearer. You're quite right to hear a wobble in what I said. What I'm reacting against is, my negative point is that people keep saying about the far right that they're a threat to democracy. And all I'm saying is they're not a threat to democracy unless they threaten the constitutional order. Their views, particularly on migration, seems to me to be odious and wrong and to be creating fear and enmity and division when we desperately need an honest and good national conversation about how we live together. I mean, that's what we need. And they are actively making that conversation more difficult. So I deeply disapprove, but they have the right, unfortunately, to speak. Where they become a threat to democracy is when they challenge and seek to use power to destroy the democratic order. That was the distinction I was trying to make, not to, I don't want anybody to go out thinking he's excusing or justifying or the anti-migrant language that we're hearing across Europe. You know, my name is Ignatieff, for God's sake. I'm the son and grandson of refugees. I mean, what the hell else can I believe but that migration and generous refugee provision is the basis of any civilized society? Because my family, I wouldn't be a Canadian had that not been the case.
There's first a question over there. I'll please give it to you well, no, you're not allowed to hold it.
You were talking earlier with some concern about the current state of global affairs, I think rightly so. In contrast, in the 1990s, people were talking about the end of history, but at the same time you had war in the Middle East with genocide, war in Europe with genocide, war in Rwanda with genocide. So what explains the difference in zeitgeist? Why do things look so much more gloomy now? Isn't the world always in a state of crisis?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Fukuyama's End of History. It's a wonderful essay, but if you create a title like that, you have to live with its consequences forever. And smart-ass commentators like me then solemnly say, history never ends, Francis. You know, we all know that history never ends. But your point is, I think, important. The 1990s for me, because I spent most of it in the Balkans and in Rwanda, was one succession after another of bloody civil wars. In the Balkans, these were wars of state formation. That is, difficult as it may seem, they were wars often about democracy. That is, when democracy came to the Balkans, the question was, who shall rule? In multi-ethnic societies, should the ethnic majority rule? And the ethnic majority said the ethnic majority must rule and the minority can get out or we'll expel them. So war was the result. Rwanda, I was in Rwanda a year after the genocide, not contemporary with the genocide. And, you know, the bodies were still unburied. I was stepping over corpses a year later. So the 1990s were exactly as you describe. They were not a holiday from history. They were history in a terrible, brutal way. But cruelly enough, neither Rwanda nor the wars in Yugoslavia destabilized the international order. It's, I think, only been since the since 9/11, the terrorist spectacular, then the financial crisis of 2008, then COVID 2019, then the invasion of Ukraine. That, it seems to me, that sequence took us into the basic collapse of the international order created since 1945. The wars of the 1990s did not fundamentally challenge the international order. That's what I was trying to say. But if your point was, were the 1990s bloody awful, you're absolutely right, 100% right.
Hi, Tine Klamboy. I'm also a university professor. And I do recognize the things you say. I'm also worried very much about the international order, about the rule of law. And I wondered whether you could elaborate how that links to the national politics, because you explained that the liberals failed in addressing the middle, so the economic middle of a country or politics or whatever. So how does that relate to the international problem that we are seeing now everywhere? And are you arguing in the same lines as Timothy Schneider with that we shouldn't go for freedom from all sorts of restrictions to freedom to be able to develop ourselves?
Mm-hmm. That's actually Isaiah Berlin's sort of
yes,
contribution to, but Snyder uses it well, I would say.
Freedom from and freedom to, that distinction is at the center of Isaiah Berlin's philosophy of liberalism, and Timothy Snyder is very critical of our idea of freedom being freedom from restriction, freedom from control, freedom from obstacles. I'm a pretty big fan of freedom from. I will push back on Timothy Snyder. But Timothy Snyder, anybody who believes in freedom too, is making an important point. We want freedom, we want women to be free from unjust marriage laws, freedom from the tyranny of male violence, and we want women to have the freedom to create the lives, the families, the businesses, the books, the culture that is in their souls. So my only view is that freedom from is a precondition for freedom to. A woman who is enslaved in an unjust marriage is not freedom, doesn't have the freedom to create the kind of life that she believes is within her grasp. So there's that. As for your other point about the relationship between the domestic and the international, I am trying to make that point that the crisis of liberalism is not just a crisis of the increasing polarization of the political systems and the collapse of the liberal center where we used to do good work. It's also a crisis of the international order, and it's a crisis that threatens to engulf and jeopardize the achievements of liberal democracy since the Second World War. And we're dealing with that contradiction at the center of our political debates. I mean, every time a Dutch prime minister sits down with his cabinet to figure out what to do about the healthcare system, the hospitals, the roads, the schools, the domestic agenda, if he's got a decent defense minister, the defense minister is going to say, what about what we owe to Ukraine? What do we owe to international development? What do we owe to international peace and security? And inevitably, because I've been in politics, the domestic priorities win. And I'm saying the problem with that is we serve the domestic priorities at the price of international peace and security. I mean, I quite understand why Dutch citizens and Canadian citizens, American citizens don't want to stump up for Ukraine. What I'm trying to say is if you don't step up, you're breeding, empowering an international axis of resistance that will destroy what remains of the post-war order. And you don't want to do that because that will endanger your life here in the Netherlands.
We're approaching, I think, one of the last questions, but that's the lady over here, ex-member of parliament.
I'm one of those left-wing politicians whom you say are polarizing just as fast as people are on the right. I disagree with that point. But what I wanted to ask is, you sketch a very acute all the problems of the international political situation, our domestic political situation, and then I'm looking for, well, what is the recipe for the answers? And what I basically hear is our side should remain playing by the old rules and do that faithfully. Mm-hmm. And then somehow or other, that's going to convince the other side to play by the rules as well. Mm-hmm. And that's the point I'm very worried about, is that if we stick, you can see it in the Netherlands. We now, as you say, our minister doesn't decide anything. It's the opposition leaders, of the coalition leaders in parliament that decide. Our liberal democracy is already on teetering point. In America, you see exactly the same with the Supreme Court. So our system is being attacked from the outside and the inside, and then our answer can't just be, we have to loyally, liberally play by the rules. I'm sure you agree with me.
That last remark shows that you have long experience in politics. It allows me to say one thing, though. My definition of liberal was pretty vague. You know, my liberalism includes social democrats. Because I come from Canada, we spend all our time doing alliances with socialists. I'm pretty ecumenical for crude electoral reasons. A liberal can't govern without the left. I mean, just so that's clear. There is a far left, La France Insoumise, who I think you can't do business with. But there are all kinds of democratic socialists I've been doing business with as a political person all my life. We can't get anything done without that creative. It's a tension because we have different views, but it's we're not even in the same family, but we need to have good, strong, close relations with each other to do the business that we agree with. So just so that is clear, and I think it's an important point that you made. Why should we play with the rules? Why should we play by the rules when they break the rules? Because I don't think the rules will survive if we start breaking them too, is I guess my answer. I said that when we're Trump, let's do a concrete example. Were Trump to win the election by transparently false means, were we to discover there was substantial electoral tampering in Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, and that's a possibility. This election will turn on 60,000 votes, folks, of 130 million cast. So it's easy to imagine a tampering operation that would steal an election. And if we had clear evidence that the election had been stolen by that side, then my view is you mount challenges in the courts, you do the legal stuff. And if that fails and you are convinced of the facts, you're in the streets. I'm a strong believer in civil disobedience. I engaged in civil disobedience as a student, and I would do so again if I felt democracy was threatened. But conversely, if Trump wins that election, and he wins it by 60,000 votes, and I haven't been able to find conclusive evidence that he stole it, I have to accept the verdict. I don't like it. I will want to protest against actions that he takes, and if he engaged in anti-constitutional or unconstitutional behavior, I would again go out in the streets. My example, I've already given one, was what if he uses the military to crush demonstrations? That's a violation of what's called the posse comitatus laws. So I don't think we're that far apart. I just think it's extremely important, having lost the political game myself, I think it's extremely important to respect the rules of the game even when you lose, and especially when you lose. The game, the legitimacy of the game and the legitimacy of the rules is reproduced by the behavior not of the winners, but the losers. And if we lose these arguments, and we lose them free and fair, then it's up to us to respect the rules of the game. So I think there is a bit of a disagreement between us about that issue. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming and engaging. We learned that engaging is really important. So for coming to the Balie, there will be a possibility to buy some books, and I understood that the author, just sitting next to me, would be willing to sign some of it. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've been stroked against the grain enough. I hope you heard some things you agreed with. I thought about this last question, and I was reminded of, I believe it's General Westmoreland, who said about a Vietnam village that in order to save the village, we had to destroy the village. Which is, I think, an interesting point, that if you lose the elections, don't lose the argument, because if you lose the rule of law or the game, you might have jeopardized the whole rule of law. But I do understand that there is dire need to sort of come up with other things than just sticking by the rules. Because if I listen to you, and if I listen to, because you also said, and I didn't want to go into that too much, but you said, I'm afraid we're already too far down the drain of the international system to be repaired, which means that it will end up with some Peloponnesian war logic of the one empire replacing the other, or and if that's, but that only points to the fact that we need to uphold the rule of law, the liberal idea of liberal democracy in the broadest sense of the word, maybe not in the strict liberal sense of the word, but the liberal democracy. Thank you for joining in, and I might have a drink with you on the bar, or a signing of the thing. Thank you very much, Michael Ignatieff.
Great.